Chapter 4 of American History Stories, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. American History Stories, Volume 2, by Mara L. Pratt. Chapter 4, Daughters of Liberty. People who write histories always tell how brave and bold and patriotic the men and boys are, but seldom do they think it worth while to tell of the brave deeds of the women and girls. Now, I don't think this is fair at all, do you, girls? And you, little boys, if your sisters had done something just as brave as your brothers had done, wouldn't you be very indignant if everybody should come to your house and praise your brothers and cheer them and all the time shouldn't speak one word to your sisters? I am sure you would. Manly, brave-hearted boys are always ready to stand up for their sisters, and are always very angry when someone hurts or neglects them in any way. Now, of course, the mothers and maidens couldn't take guns and swords and go into battle as the men did, although they did even do that in some cases. But let us see what they did do. Somebody must stay home and take care of the children, and the homes, and keep up the farms. So the brave women said to their husbands and sons, "You go into the battlefield, because you are stronger and larger and know about war. We will stay at home and keep the children cared for, that they may grow up strong to help you by and by. We will spin and weave day and night to keep you in yarn for stockings, and in cloth for clothes and blankets to keep you warm. We will plant and harvest and grind the corn, and do all your work on the farm that there may be food to send you, and food to keep you from starving when you all come home again." What think you, would the brave men in any war do if it were not for the brave women back of them at home to keep them from starving? Oh, it is a mean, cowardly man who would say that because the women didn't go forth in battle array, that they didn't do their half in saving our country from British soldiers. Let us see who these Daughters of Liberty, as they called themselves, were. As soon as the trouble between England and America broke out, the men had formed themselves into societies, and had called themselves Sons of Liberty. They pledged themselves to do everything in their power to drive back the English rule. The women, too, not wishing to appear to be one step behind their fathers and husbands and brothers, formed themselves into societies, the Daughters of Liberty. They pledged themselves not to buy a dress or a ribbon or a glove or any article whatever that came from England. They formed spinning societies to make their own yarn and linen, and they wove the cloth for their own dresses and for the clothes of their fathers and brothers and husbands and sons. The women used to meet together to see who would spin the fastest. One afternoon a party of young girls met at the house of the minister for a spinning match. When they left, they presented the minister with 30 skeins of yarn, the fruit of their afternoon's work. The old women, some of whom were too old to do very much work, pledged themselves to give up their tea drinking because the tea came to them from England, and because England had put a heavy tax on it. These dear old ladies, who loved their tea drinking so much, bravely stood by their pledge. They drank catnip and sage and all sorts of herb teas, and pretended they liked it very much. But I suspect many an old lady went to bed tired and nervous, and arose in the morning with an aching head, all for the want of a good cup of tea. At that time there appeared in the newspapers many verses written by the English officers, no doubt, often making fun of these brave women, old and young. Here is one of the verses: "O Boston wives and maids, draw near and see Our delicate souchong and hyson tea. Buy it, my charming girls, fair, black, or brown. If not, we'll cut your throats and burn your town." Within 18 months, wrote a gentleman at Newport, Rhode Island, 487 yards of cloth and 36 pairs of stockings have been spun and knit in the family of James Nixon of this town. In Newport and Boston, the ladies, at their tea drinkings, used, instead of imported tea, the dried leaves of the raspberry. They called this substitute Hyperion. The class of 1770 at Cambridge took their diplomas in homespun suits, that they too might show their defiance of English taxation without representation. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of American History Stories, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. American History Stories, Volume 2, by Laura L. Pratt. Chapter 5. The Boston Boys. Here is a story about the Boston boys, which is a match for the one you have just read about the Boston girls. On Boston Common the boys used to skate and coast and build forts, just as other boys do today. Perhaps their skates weren't quite so elegant as those the Boston boys have now, and very likely their sleds were clumsy homemade affairs, not at all like the beautiful double runners and the toboggans you boys are so proud of. Nevertheless, those little lads then had just as jolly times coasting down the same hills and skating the same ponds. The English had, by this time, become so convinced that the colonists were preparing for war that they sent over a large detachment of red-coated soldiers. These soldiers made headquarters in Boston, and soon became generally disagreeable to the people. The boys had been watching eagerly the freezing of the ice on the pond on the common. "Tomorrow," thought they, "the ice will be strong enough to bear, and then hurrah for skating!" Eagerly the boys hastened to the pond in the morning, their skates over their shoulders, their faces bright with the thought of the pleasure before them. But what do you suppose the cowardly soldiers had done during the night? Having nothing else to do, they had broken the ice all over the pond, and just to bother these little boys. Don't you think those great, strong soldiers must have had very mean hearts to go to work to plague little boys in that manner? I am inclined to think these boys were pretty angry when they learned who had done this cowardly act, and very likely they scolded furiously about it. Again and again the soldiers did the same thing. At last, one day when the boys were building a fort, some of these soldiers came idling along and knocked down the fort with their guns. The boys, now angry through and through, determined no longer to bear this mean treatment. "Let us go to General Gage," said one of the boys, "and tell him how the soldiers are treating us, and if he is any kind of man he will put a stop to it." And go they did at once. With eyes ablaze with anger, they marched into the presence of the great English general. After they had laid their wrongs before him, he said, "Have your fathers been teaching you, too, to rebel, and did they send you here to show their feelings?" "Nobody sent us, sir," answered the leader, "but your soldiers have insulted us, thrown down our forts, broken the ice on our pond, spoiled our coasts, and we will not stand it." General Gage could not help laughing at the earnestness of these plucky little fellows. He promised that the soldiers should not bother them any more. Then turning to an officer near by, he said, "Even the children here draw in the love of liberty with the very air they breathe." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of American History Stories, Volume 2. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. American History Stories, Volume 2, by Laura L. Pratt. Chapter 6. A Brave Little Girl. While General Gage held the town of Boston, our people were nearly starved, because of the number of British soldiers that must be fed. Accordingly, men were sent into the surrounding villages to obtain help. Parson White, of the little town of Windham, urged his people to give all they could, and his little daughter, catching the spirit of loyalty, wondered how she could help the suffering Bostonians. Soon after, the villagers prepared to send Frederick Manning to the town with sheep and cattle and a load of wheat. The little girl thought of her pet lamb. Could she, ought she to part with it? Running to her father, she eagerly asked his advice. But the parson, smiling kindly, said, "No, dear, it is not necessary that your little heart be tried by this bitter strife," and bade her run away and be happy. But the thought would not leave her. There in Boston were little girls, no older than herself, crying for food and clothing. She must give all she could to help them. At last the day came on which the cattle and supplies of help were to be driven to town. Choking down her sobs, the little martyr untied her pet from the old apple tree, and crossing the fields waited for Manning, the driver at the crossroads. "Please, sir," she said, her lip quivering, and the tears rolling down her cheeks, "I want to do something for the poor starving people in Boston. I want to do my part, but I have nothing but this one little lamb. Please, sir, take it to Boston with you. But couldn't you carry it in your arms a part of the way? 'Cause it is so little, sir." Then bursting into tears and throwing her apron over her eyes as if to shut out the sight of her dear little pet, she ran towards her home. Poor, brave little girl! I hope when she told her mamma and papa what she had done, that they took their little girl up in their arms and kissed her many, many times, and told her what a dear, brave little girl she had been. I suspect the tears were in their eyes too, when she told them, and I have always wished the good parson had sent a fleet messenger to overtake the driver and bring back the little lamb to its loving owner, for I think it took more real courage to give up that one pet lamb than it did for the Boston boys to go before General Gage when the soldiers had spoiled their fort. End of chapter 6.